Good day. One of the curiosities of the Ukrainian war is that from time to time one finds that some of Ukraine's Western supporters, in this particular case the British government, appear to take a more optimistic view of the situation on the battlefields even than Ukraine itself does. I say that because the latest British Ministry of Defence bulletin or account of the war. By the way, I have long since stopped paying much attention to these British Ministry of Defence bulletins, but never mind. The very latest one shows seems to claim that the fighting in the Ukrainian town of Liman, or Krasny Liman as the Russians prefer to call it, which was stormed by the Russians yesterday and now seems to be fully under their control. Well, the British Ministry of Defence appears to argue or suggest that there is still fighting going on there. This certainly is an exaggeration of what might still be skirmishes with Ukrainian stragglers who might still be in Krasny Liman, but there is no doubt at all, and the Ukrainians barely deny it, that Krasny Liman, or Liman, is now fully under Russian control. And in fact, the latest situational maps which I have seen bear this out. They suggest that in fact Russian forces are continuing their advance, and the latest map that I've seen, for what it's worth, but these maps which have come out and which I find on various websites, some of them have been very reliable, and the particular provider of this map has tended to be reliable in the past. Anyway, they show Russian troops advancing from Krasny Liman, having made up roughly a third of the distance between Krasny Liman and the important center of Slavyansk, where, together with Kramatorsk, a large part of the remaining Ukrainian force in Donbass is still located. And there's also been reports that just ahead of this Russian advance, the Ukrainians have now destroyed a bridge at a place called Raigorodok, which is obviously intended to slow the Russian advance towards Slavyansk. So anyway, that is the situation in Liman. And as I said, it's curious how the British government, the British Ministry of Defence at least, continues to pretend that things are less bad for Ukraine or for the Ukrainians in Donbass than it actually is. The British were very much at the forefront of the claims about Ukrainian victories made earlier in the fighting, and perhaps the fact that they were so vocal in talking up Ukrainian successes or alleged successes, maybe that makes it more difficult for them to acknowledge the reality that the situation for Ukraine is becoming increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Donbass, there now seems to be fighting within Severodonetsk itself, and there's now video evidence which appears to conclusively confirm that the Russians are in control of a hotel complex there, the Mir Hotel Complex. I've no idea where in Severodonetsk this hotel is located, whether it's in the center of the city or the outskirts, but for what it's worth, it does seem as if the Russians have captured it. And that does seem to show that they are indeed operating within Severodonetsk, within the city itself. And there's also similar reports that there are other Russian forces, or perhaps, to be more precise, Chechen forces fighting as part of the Russian military, which have now penetrated into Lysychansk itself. Now, yesterday, there were reports circulating that the governor of Lugansk province was talking about a full-scale withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Now, apparently, this is still just possible. Well, a day has passed. There's no sign of such a retreat. On the contrary, all the indications are that the noose around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is tightening. Last night, the authorities of the Lugansk People's Republic claimed that all the remaining road links to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk have been cut. So it's probably becoming increasingly difficult for the Ukrainian forces in these two towns to fight their way out, which is presumably what they would have to do. And to be frank, there doesn't seem to be any decision or will on the part of the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev to order their withdrawal. Instead, what we are getting are further claims from the Ukrainian defense minister that all sorts of wonder weapons from the West are going to change the outcome of the battle. And he's been talking about the fact that Ukraine has now received American 777 howitzers, Caesar self-propelled guns from France, M109 guns from various people, Harpoon missiles. These will all supposedly change the course of the war. And we've also receiving reports, very confused reports at the moment, very contradictory reports about the possibility that the United States might supply to Ukraine M270 multiple rocket launchers, also to counter the Russians. Now, I'm not a military expert, I'm not a technical expert, I'm not in a position to assess the capabilities of these weapon systems. I'm going to say that none of them are especially new. All of them, it seems to me, are replacing weapon systems that Ukraine has previously had. And it is replacing those weapon systems in limited numbers. To give one example, these M270 multiple rocket systems, about which many people have been talking about, they are an American weapon system developed by the United States in the 1970s after the United States saw the effectiveness of Soviet multiple rocket systems, the Grad systems of that period, during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The United States up to that time did not have such systems in its arsenal. It had such systems during the Second World War, but after the Second World War it stopped using them or making them. But it saw how effective they were during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and it decided that it would make some for itself. And the result was the M270 system. Now, I'm going to say a few things about the M270 system. These are not expert views, but they are my own personal views. Certainly in itself, it is an effective system. And when it was designed in the 1970s, it was probably ahead of the Soviet systems of that period. Certainly, it was a much more advanced system than the Grad system that the Soviets had supplied to the Arab states, and which was the one that was used in the Yom Kippur War, and which caused the United States to develop the M270. Now, having said that, I'm going to make one brief observation about the M270, which is based upon such technical knowledge as I have, and it is this. Briefly, on the basis of what I can see of it and of its specifications, what happened fairly typically is that the United States took what was originally a simple and cheap but very effective Soviet system, the Grad system of the 1960s and 1970s, and developed its own much more sophisticated, far more expensive, much more complex system, which perhaps in the 1970s did provide certain capabilities that the Grad did not have, but which has probably now been equalized by later Soviet systems, Russian systems, like the Uragan and the Smerch, which, so far as I can see, appear to have, in their essential form, fairly similar capabilities to the M270. And in relation to the Uragan, the Ukrainians, of course, already had the Uragan in their arsenal at the start of the war, and they probably still have it to some extent up to this day, though no doubt they've suffered losses with that system as well. Now, perhaps the M270 does still have some technical edge over the Smerch and the Uragan system. Though I have to say that if one is talking about maximum ranges of the basic rocket systems, all of these systems use many different kinds of rockets of different capabilities. But if one is talking about the absolute ranges of the most advanced of the rocket systems, the Smerch and the M270 seem to be about the same. There is one factor about the M270, at least the original M270 that was developed in the 1970s, which, however, seems to me to be a costly addition of dubious utility. And that is that, unlike the Russian systems and Soviet and Russian systems, all of which were designed for use from the back of a simple wheeled truck or wheeled chassis, the M270 uses a tracked chassis. Now, anybody who has any experience of tracked vehicles knows that they are significantly less reliable than wheeled vehicles and very maintenance heavy. They do have certain advantages over rough terrain, but is this really necessary for this sort of long-range artillery piece? I wonder. I'm not quite sure why the US decided to go for a tracked chassis. Certainly the wheeled Russian ones apparently are very effective over most forms of unpaved terrain. And it does seem to me that if it is the tracked version of this system which the United States is intending to supply, then that does provide for a whole extra level of complexity and maintenance use, which the Ukrainians may struggle with. But beyond that, I would say that the feature of the M270, which has attracted the most attention, and which I think is the one that people think about and discuss when they talk about the system and about it providing an extra capability over and above all the other multiple rocket systems in use, is that it does apparently have a particular type of, can launch a particular type of guided missile. I'm going to call it the ATACMS, though I'm not sure how that word is pronounced, which is some kind of a battlefield missile, long-range missile with a range of up to 300 kilometers, which is certainly different from the kind of systems that you tend to find on systems like Smerch and Uragan. However, again, I'm not really sure that this adds a significant new capability. I mean, Ukraine has had guided battlefield weapons like the Tochka-U. The ATACMS has a longer range, but the Russians have shown an ability to shoot down Ukrainian guided missiles, and they might be able, for all I know, to shoot down the ATACMS as well. Besides, the Russians have their Iskander missiles, which they're operating with great effectiveness in Ukraine, and which seem to me to offer analogous capabilities. And I would have thought that these very bulky systems, especially their track systems, which the Ukrainians would presumably want to deploy at some area close to the battlefield, that they will be particular targets for Russian aerial forces, and I wonder how long in practice they would survive on the battlefields. About a week ago, when the Russians were talking about the fact that they'd used a laser system to shoot down, to destroy a Ukrainian drone, apparently a commercial drone. There was much ridicule about this in the Western media, and there was much talk about the fact that the Russians were talking about wonder weapons which would supposedly turn the direction of the war, change the direction of the war. Well, it seems to me that the reality is that it is the Ukrainians, far more than the Russians, who are hoping for the miraculous effect of Western wonder weapons, be it 777 howitzers, Caesar self-propelled guns, and of course M270 multiple rocket systems. They're not going to be provided in anything like the necessary quantities to make the dramatic difference that some people in Ukraine appear to hope. They're not going to change the overall situation, the military balance on the battlefields. The Russians seem to be very relaxed about these weapon systems, whose capabilities they are undoubtedly extremely well informed about, and which no doubt they have long since worked out methods to counter. I think that the Ukrainians are placing excessive reliance and excessive hopes on these systems, and I suspect they will be crushingly disappointed when they find that they are not the great strategic military game changer that they imagine they will be. Anyway, that's my thoughts about these systems. Perhaps, since we're talking about Ukraine, it might be more useful, in my opinion, in charting Ukraine's long-term problems, to look at the actual state of the Ukrainian government's finances. And we've had now a comment from the Ukrainian Finance Ministry, a breakdown of funding from the Ukrainian Finance Ministry. And it makes some very interesting telling. Now, I'm taking this from Interfax, which is a Russian news agency, but it's not a government news agency, it's an independent news agency. And I have up to now always found it extremely reliable. And I'm sure that these figures, which Interfax says come from Ukraine, are accurate and correct. And this is what Interfax tells us the Ukrainian Finance Ministry says are the breakdowns of funds that make up Ukraine's current budget. And it says the following, and it breaks them down as follows. Allocations from the European Union in the amount of $603 million and from the United States in the amount of $500 million, as well as 431 million return on war bonds, were the primary source of Ukrainian budget revenue last week, the Ukrainian Finance Ministry said in a statement on its website. So just think about that. Ukraine, its primary source of budget revenue last week, around $1.1 billion, was funding $603 million from the European Union and $500 million from the United States, as well as proceeds from a $431 million war bond. In other words, borrowing. So Ukraine's primary funding, its biggest share of funding at the moment, is coming from external donors, from the European Union to the tune of $603 million and $500 million from the United States last week. And Ukraine is also borrowing heavily from itself, from its own people, to the tune of $431 million. And the finance ministry, again according to Interfax, went on to say that war bonds yielded $3 billion between February 24th and May 25th. And the budget gained $1.382 billion from the European Union and $986 million from the United States. So about $2.2 billion from external donors, the European Union and the United States, since between February 24th and May 25th, slightly less, but not much less, than the Ukrainian war bond. Well, 2/3 of the Ukrainian war bond, which is $3 billion. So Ukraine is borrowing from its people via war bonds. I don't quite know how those war bonds operate. And of course, it's also having to receive money. It's becoming increasingly dependent on foreign funding from the European Union and from the United States to the tune of $2.1 billion since February. But then, of course, we then learned that the largest contribution of all came from the National Bank of Ukraine, $4.1 billion. This is this period between February 24th and May 25th. Now, what does that mean? $4.1 billion from the Central Bank of Ukraine. Well, it looks to me as if Ukraine's printing money. So $3 billion in a war bond, $2.1 billion from the European Union and the United States. That's $5 billion since 24th of February. And then another $4 billion, which is presumably, or so it seems to me, printed money. Anyway, there are other funds. Ukraine has received other funds. We learned that there's been loans from international financial institutions, bilateral loans, presumably some of these are from foreign governments, and grants, again, from other financial institutions. Note that tax revenue is not mentioned in this report. So Ukraine is becoming increasingly dependent on foreign funders, on foreign donors, notably the European Union and the United States. It's printing money, but it's borrowing money through war bonds. It's receiving grants and loans from various people, but increasingly it is the United States and the European Union who are bankrolling it. Tax revenue, as far as I can see, appears to have almost completely collapsed. And I suspect that this is going to go on getting worse and worse the longer the war goes on for. And well, we saw what happened in Afghanistan when external funding stopped after the Taliban marched into Kabul. The entire economy of the country in Afghanistan basically imploded because by this point, over those long 20 years, the United States had become the major source of government revenue. And we see exactly the same pattern is now steadily repeating itself with respect to Ukraine. A war of attrition fought in Ukraine is not weakening Russia, it is destroying Ukraine. More Ukrainian soldiers are being killed, more Ukrainian weapons are being destroyed, more Ukrainian infrastructure is being damaged and destroyed, more Ukrainian cities are being bombed, Ukrainian harvest has collapsed, the real economy in Ukraine has collapsed. The only thing that's keeping Ukraine going, the only thing that's keeping this house of cards together is external funding. It's the only thing, I suspect, that's propping up the Ukrainian currency And with every day, every week, Ukraine becomes more dependent upon it. Now, this is unsustainable, and the longer it goes on, the more dangerous and the more damaging and the more corrosive it becomes. Well, that, it seems to me, is a brief summary of the state of the war. We're not, of course, only looking at the situation in Ukraine itself. Lots of other things are going on around the world, but since this is primarily a program about Ukraine, I'm going to say that it seems that President Erdogan of Turkey is now hardening again his comments about Finland and Sweden joining NATO. In fact, he's becoming increasingly critical about this, as is his foreign minister. And we've learnt that on the 27th of May, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said that an approach of, and this is, I'm now quoting his exact words, an approach of "will convince Turkey in time anyway, we are friends and allies" is not correct. Sweden and Finland need to take concrete steps. And apparently the Biden administration, for its part, is saying that, this is nothing to do with them. It's not a US issue. It means it has to be sorted out between Sweden, Finland and Turkey, something which the Turks have taken extremely badly. Apparently, Erdogan suggested that President Biden himself should come to Turkey for talks about this complex issue. Biden has said that I'm not going to Turkey, but I think we're okay. The Turks, Erdogan has not taken to that at all well. And it seems that on the 23rd of May, about a week ago, in other words, Erdogan spoke out and became even more prickly about this. He said, "We have told these countries, Sweden and Finland, that they have to choose between providing practical and political support to terrorist organizations and expecting Turkey's consent to their NATO membership. And they have to show this with explicit signs." Let me underscore it once again hereby. Those who back and provide every kind of support to terrorist organizations that pose a threat to Turkey should first of all abandon their unlawful, insincere and arrogant attitude towards us. May no one have any doubts whatsoever that we as Turkey will do our part once we see concrete practices indicating such a change. So Erdogan is making it very clear that he wants to see Finland and Sweden make real moves, what he interprets as real moves, before Turkey will consent to them joining NATO. He's taking it very amiss, apparently, that President Biden and the administration are treating this subject so casually. They're saying, Biden isn't going to travel to NATO. It's Turkey on the one hand and Sweden and Finland on the other to sort this all out. Apparently Erdogan doesn't like that at all. And at the same time, he clearly feels that the Swedes and the Finns are not taking this issue of their support for various Kurdish militia groups at all seriously, or anywhere near sufficiently seriously to persuade him to change his position. And then adding to all of this, it seems that President Erdogan was absolutely furious with the fact that the Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, went to the US Congress and lobbied against the sale of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. Now, it seems that Erdogan had taken this deal to buy F-16 fighter jets. Turkey has already been pushed out of the F-35 project because it bought S-400 missiles from Russia. But Erdogan took the alternative of buying obviously much less sophisticated F-16 fighter jets from the United States as a sign by the United States of goodwill, of a serious attempt by the administration to improve relations with Turkey. And it seems that Erdogan has now heard that Mitsotakis is lobbying in Congress to block the F-16 sale, has been gaining traction, and that he feels personally betrayed by this. And he has actually made some extremely strong comments about Mitsotakis. On the 23rd of May, Erdogan said, "Mitsotakis no longer exists for me. I will never agree to meet him." So, major rift now between Greece and Turkey, two NATO allies. Mitsotakis has enraged Erdogan. Erdogan feels angry with the US for listening to Mitsotakis and giving him this long applause in Congress. And he feels betrayed by the US over the F-16 deal. And on top of that, he feels that Sweden and Finland are not paying proper heed to his concerns about the Kurds. And he's saying through his foreign minister, Cavusoglu, that the Finns and the Swedes need to change their positions fast, because simply saying, we're old friends, this can all be sorted out, simply isn't good enough. So it looks as if Erdogan is actually hardening his position on Sweden's and Finland's prospective entries into NATO. Now, I don't think people in Washington or Brussels are taking this seriously. Apparently there was a meeting between the Turks and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. I'm not sure to what extent Stoltenberg understands how seriously Erdogan is taking this. I suspect that in Erdogan's case, this was originally intended as a bargaining ploy. But I think the aloof attitude that the Western powers have taken, especially the United States, has incensed him. And bear in mind that Erdogan and Biden don't get on anyway. And with Erdogan, a difficult individual at the best of times, I think this is going to annoy him even more. So I think that this idea that Erdogan is simply going to rubber stamp Sweden and Finland's entry into NATO, I think the prospects of that are starting to fade. And unless there's a real effort made over the next few weeks to try to win him round, and that may require some practical concessions, that may not prove possible. Now, that's not just Erdogan that the United States at this critical moment seems to be, the relations with him, the United States seems to be mismanaging. We've also seen a speech by Secretary Blinken about China. And Secretary Blinken said all kinds of things about China, but he went on to say that China remains for the United States the primary adversary, the country that is apparently the greatest threat to this rules-based international order, which the United States believes itself the leader of. And the Chinese are already, I think, by now, deeply mistrustful of this administration. And of course, hearing what Blinken is saying, and this coming after President Biden's extraordinary maladroit comments about the US defending Taiwan, comments which have been to some extent walked back by members of his administration, but which undoubtedly the Chinese think is a Freudian slip. In other words, a slip which basically says what the real policy of the United States is. Well, all of that is going to make the Chinese especially angry and especially concerned and increasingly convinced that sooner or later the United States is going to come into conflict with China over Taiwan, and that China needs to prepare for that fact. And then, of course, we have a increasing escalating situation between the United States and Iran. We've seen oil tankers being seized, this at a time of energy shortages, of an oil crisis, of oil price increases around the world. Well, the United States seizes tankers. Iran now retaliates by seizing 2 Greek tankers. The United States has refused to change its designation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, something which the Iranians had said was an absolute indispensable precondition for the signing off of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the new nuclear deal. So it looks as if that deal, the nuclear deal, is itself now in perhaps terminal crisis. All of this going on. And of course, at the same time, the Iranians are busy, just as the Chinese are busy, buying Russian oil, carrying out military drills with the Russians, Russian aircraft and Chinese aircraft over the Sea of Japan. The Iranians, of course, are now pressing forward to integrate their payment systems, their national payment systems, with the Russian payment system. And there's talk of a Iranian-Russian deal, economic deal, coming on top of the Chinese deal, which the Iranians and the Russians, the Iranians and the Chinese have already signed off on. And of course, at a time when Russia's economy is in deflation, I get to do a program about that, which you can watch on Locals very shortly if you want to sign up on Locals. There's possible talk of linking the Iranian currency to the ruble, which might actually, with further economic linkages, perhaps just conceivably, start to bring Iranian inflation under control as well. Well, we'll talk about that in another program. But anyway, all of this going on, the United States is bogged down, is facing a confrontation with Russia in Ukraine, in effect a proxy war. It's looking for confrontation with China. It seems to be drifting into a confrontation with Iran. There are now stories circulating that Argentina is now thinking of joining the BRICS group. This is this group of Russia, China, Brazil, India, and South Africa. That Saudi Arabia, apparently, and Argentina apparently definitely, but apparently Saudi Arabia also is also now thinking about joining the BRICS. In other words, joining up with this Chinese-led, Chinese and Russian-led international grouping. It seems to me that the administration is, in effect, looking for fights everywhere with everyone. Even relations between Britain, the United States' most important ally, and the United States, the administration itself, are not what they perhaps optimally could be. There's even reports circulating in Britain that the administration is now threatening to limit intelligence cooperation with Britain if Britain doesn't toe the line on the Northern Ireland Protocol, this issue that exists between Britain and the European Union. It gives me the impression of an administration that reacts viscerally to every problem. It doesn't sit down, it doesn't calculate, it doesn't decide on priorities, it certainly doesn't negotiate in earnest. It has visceral feelings about Russia, visceral feelings about China, visceral feelings about Iran, even visceral feelings about Britain and Ireland. And instead of sitting down and thinking them through, it just follows those feelings and gets itself, as I said, into fights with just about everybody. Certainly, the Turkey, Finland, Sweden thing could have, in my opinion, have been handled much better, as Erdogan in effect has said he's not 100% decided against agreeing to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. He's not saying that he will veto Finland and Sweden's applications to join NATO, irrespective of what happens. What he has said is he's got certain concerns about the Kurds that he wants addressed. And he wants also signs from the United States that it is taking Turkey seriously, that it's going to provide Turkey with these F-16 fighter jets, that it's going to do all those sort of things. And the fact that the administration, even on such an important issue, isn't prepared to sit down with the Turks and agree upon that, shows the extent to which this is an administration that simply doesn't do diplomacy, doesn't calculate, as I said, doesn't assess priorities. One would have thought that at this time, given the commitment, the decision, unwise though it was, to have Finland and Sweden apply to join NATO, that this should be the matter that the administration should be focusing on and trying to find some way through Turkey's issues ought to be the priority. Well, there we are, an administration that looks for fights with everybody, that is supplying weapons to Ukraine, that's bankrolling Ukraine, even as Ukraine becomes increasingly dependent upon the United States, but is never supplied with anything like sufficient numbers of weapons to win its war, which probably anyway, given how much more powerful Russia is almost certainly anyway unwinnable. And as I've already said, these Western weapon systems, it seems to me that they're really wonder weapons. They're the kind of things that exist. Well, they exist in fact, but they exist even more in the imagination, and that I'm sure the real military people on the battle lines must be getting increasingly skeptical about them. So there we go. Growing confrontation, growing international crises, a war that's going wrong in Ukraine. It doesn't seem to me as if the international situation is getting any better. That, it seems to me, is a further summary and update of the situation today. It does seem to me that Secretary Blinken, if he's to do his job, ought to be undertaking some diplomacy for a change, not striking poses about China. But there we go. An administration that clearly doesn't do diplomacy, a drifting situation, a situation that's going from bad to worse, and a war in Ukraine which is being lost and which will be another massive debacle. There it is. That's me for today. More from me soon, presumably tomorrow. Thank you for joining me again today. And just to repeat, you can find us on other platforms, Rumble and Locals. And of course, if you're watching this video on Rumble, you can go to the top of the video. You'll see the red maroon button that will take you directly to our Locals homepage. And you can join us on Locals and participate on Locals in our exclusive content there. I'm going to be doing a program shortly about the Russian economy, for example, and where it's going, and that's going to appear exclusively on Locals. And of course, you can also join and participate in my live streams, which take place exclusively on Locals on Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time if you join us on Locals. And we are on we're also on other platforms. We are on platforms like the new free speech platform, Super U. We are on ODYSEE, on others too. We've got a Telegram channel. You can also support us if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar if you like our work. You can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things you will find there. Our Duran hats, our t-shirts, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and of course our famous magic mugs. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. More from me probably tomorrow. And have a very good day until then.